Discipline and punishment within the school setting has always been viewed as somewhat of a deterrent from bad behaviour by teachers and parents. However, students sometimes see these punishments as somewhat confusing or unnecessary. I have witnessed this myself firsthand through interviews with students and teachers. Unsurprisingly, students see certain school rules, such as taking your coat off indoors as soon as you step in the building, as unnecessary and achieving nothing. Whereas many teachers I interviewed thought that discipline and punishment within the school setting reinforces the authority of the teacher, and that the reason why certain students fail to listen is due to the inconsistency of other teachers in policing the school rules, rather than seeing a problem with the rules and punishments themselves. I agree somewhat with the students and somewhat with the teachers, in that I agree that certain rules are pointless, but I believe that the underlying reason for pointless rules is authority, and an unnecessary reinforcement of authority at that. Therefore, in this essay I will examine problems with this reinforcement of authority as it is instructed by the government and implemented by teachers, and conclude that not only does this discipline and punishment ethos not work effectively and is paradoxical, but also that its underlying structural reasons are outdated and therefore uphold negative historical, ethical and moral perspectives. I will critically analyse in this essay two government documents on legislation and instruction for teaching, the first being the Department of Education's Behaviour and Discipline in Schools. In this document, in section 13, it states, "Teachers can discipline students whose conduct falls below the standard which could reasonably be expected of them." This statement, upon first viewing, seems broad and non-constrictive for the teacher in a positive way. However, a closer inspection can see that this statement can in fact reinforce negative behaviour by teachers unwittingly, due to its very broad nature. By this I mean that because the above quote talks of the standards that could be expected of a pupil, it means that subliminally, bias in a teacher's mind could affect the standards at which they believe a student should reasonably attain. An example of this is seen with the rapper, author and political activist Akala. In his book Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire, Akala discusses how a teacher's racial bias led to unfair disciplinary actions being used upon him. Examples included his teacher ripping up a drawing and making him redraw it several times, whilst the rest of the class played outside, and being put into a special educational needs group despite being good at his work. Akala also quotes a study by Bristol University whereby students' blind assessment marks were compared with the assessment marks given by a teacher that knows them, the result being that Indian and Chinese students were rated higher by their teachers, and that teachers assess black pupils' academic ability as being far lower than their actual academic ability, and underestimate their intelligence twice as much as they do for white children. To the practitioner at the time, the behaviour witnessed by Akala firsthand would be seen as normal. However, from our outside perspective, such punishments are absurd. Another example of absurd punishment, but from a different perspective, is seen in Bertrand Russell's Education and Social Order, whereby he discusses that in schools of his time, schoolmasters would punish children for wetting the bed even though the punishments wouldn't help, and that the cause of the habit in older boys is usually some deeper-seated unconscious psychological disturbance. This suggests that teachers inflict discipline and punishment unfairly, even wittingly as well as unwittingly, as they know full well that discipline will not cure this disorder. So what does this all mean? Well, I believe that the government statement is too broad and too generalised, and as a result it has a twofold effect. The first being that those who merely follow it and implement the rule will attach to it their biases in education, racial, economic biases and cultural biases. For example, those students with less cultural capital or with limited access to books may be punished for failing to meet the standards which could be reasonably expected of them. Secondly, this statement, I believe, supports a teacher's intuition to punish as appropriate, i.e. if behaviour falls behind a certain imaginary line, even if punishment does not seem to work, the teacher will still feel the need to inflict it upon the student. Of course, it can be argued that class, race and psychological issues are part and parcel of the reasonably expected part of the statement, so that the teacher can adjust their punishment accordingly. This could be true, however I believe that firstly for those that just read the statement, it doesn't encourage the teacher to think critically about the way their punishment is delivered to each individual student. And secondly, it may say reasonable expectations, but to truly be effective it has to define what these reasonable expectations are, as each practitioner has different levels of expectation compared to another. So far we have concluded that current advice from the government is in part too broad and as a result ignorant of economic and racial bias. In the second part of the essay we will analyse the exercise of this authority and what this means for broader practice. We will analyse this through the second document, the Teacher's Standards Overview. In this document, as with the former, authority and discipline is stressed and emphasised as key. For example, maintain good relationships with pupils, exercise appropriate authority, and act decisively when necessary. This statement reinforces the same problems witnessed in the earlier, as there are of course philosophical problems with what is appropriate punishment, and is punishment a good thing at all? We must through these confront the question that if punishments are seemingly used regularly and unfairly, then what is the case for the punishment system we have in schools? Well, many may argue that the case for the punishment lies within power and authority. Marxist educational theory, for example, would say that punishment and the education system are there as part of a wider ideological state apparatus to indoctrinate and make low-skilled workers for the enablement of the capitalist system to continue. Now, to an extent I agree that discipline and punishment are used as form of control in the education system. Such pointless rules, I believe, are reflective of those which a worker may have to obey when they leave the education system. Not only that, but I agree that as advanced industrial society is seen as a system of repression that stifles debate, so too the education system, I believe, stifles debate. This is so people can learn mere basics for low-skilled jobs rather than being a critical member of our democracy, which I would say is far more important. However, I believe that discipline, punishment and power structure go far deeper than the Marxist analysis. Power structures in school work twofold in a paradoxical sense, in that harsh and sometimes absurd rules are in place so that punishments are a regular occurrence. Yet simultaneously the teacher has to maintain good relationships with pupils. Surely to be the one who constantly punishes things that are not worthy of being punished, you are not going to gain a positive relationship with the people you inflict punishment upon. This points out to me the real absurdity here of government legislature, its broadness and its pursuit of opposite goals. In the first statement there was a paradox of reasonable expectations in that reasonable expectations differ from practitioner to practitioner, and therefore behaviour is never punished equally, and therefore students are left in a state of perpetual confusion. And secondly, that teachers are supposed to be friendly, whilst also being this strict authoritarian figure that punishes seemingly harmless behaviour and enforces a rigid system of non-critical thinking. In short, power structures in school need to be reassessed. Subliminal bias needs to be challenged. And more importantly, a broader systematic change needs to happen within current legislature and attitudes towards punishment, lest we carry on living up to a careless statement that state schooling in Britain both today and when I was a child seems to be stuck in a Victorian-era paradigm, guided by notions of discipline, obedience and deference to one's betters, of becoming a good worker and getting a good job.